Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Story of Religion in America, an Introduction, by James P. Bird and James Hudnut-Beumler. Narrated by Jim Seybert. Introduction. Christopher Columbus saw what he wanted to see. On October 12, 1492, he landed on an island in the Caribbean he believed was off the mainland of Southeast Asia, then called India. There, he and his entourage met a native people who identified themselves with the word Taino, by which they meant both people and especially good people, in contrast to their more aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. All of this was lost on Columbus. He later reported to King Ferdinand of Spain that the natives on this and other islands were of childlike innocence, eager to give the Spaniards valuables, including gold. The Taino should be easy to convert, thought Columbus. As he later wrote the king, they do not hold any creed, nor are they idolaters. But they also believe that power and good are in the heavens, and were very firmly convinced that I, with these ships and men, came from the heavens, and in this belief they everywhere received me after they had mastered their fear. Columbus captured 24 Taino natives on his first voyage to take them back to Spain and have them trained to be forced missionaries to their own people. 6 would survive the second voyage. Those Taino left on the island of San Salvador, as Columbus renamed it, were treated little better than those on nearby Hispaniola, where, during the visit of his second voyage, Columbus began to require tribute. Each male over 14 years of age was expected to mine and deliver a hawk's bell full of gold, about a quarter ounce, every 3 months, or lacking this, 25 pounds of spun cotton. If this tribute was not paid, the Spanish cut off the delinquent Taino's hands, letting them bleed to death. And why did Columbus need the gold? Because, influenced by the Spanish Franciscans, he believed that he and his contemporaries were living in the last 150 years before the end of time, and the gold was desperately needed to help Spain recapture Jerusalem from Islam, part of the same plan that saw the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, and in the year 1492 led Spain to execute 30,000 Jews for not converting to Christianity. Even before his first voyage, Columbus was reminding Ferdinand and Isabella of his gold for crusade plan. I urged your highnesses to spend all the profits of this my enterprise on the conquest of Jerusalem, and your highnesses laughed and said that it would please them, and that even without this profit they had that desire. Christopher Columbus was a religious zealot. Perhaps it was for the best that Columbus proved so poor in inquiring into the religious beliefs of the Taino, for their religion was polytheistic, featuring worship of zemis or spirits. Yakahu, a male spirit, was god of their main crop, yucca, and the sea. His mother, Atabe, was the goddess of the moon, fresh waters, and fertility. Lesser spirits accounted for every other aspect of life, including why hurricanes sometimes came, and where people went when they died. Between disease, enslavement, and cultural annihilation, the Taino would be destroyed nearly everywhere except present-day Puerto Rico, where a remnant of their DNA and tribal ways are still preserved, nurtured, and celebrated. The way religion was involved in the conflict between Spaniards and indigenous people in the 1490s is not an isolated event. American religious history is replete with clashes of cultures and beliefs, often with lives at stake. 509 autumns later, on the North American mainland at New York's Yankee Stadium, an extraordinary religious gathering took place to mourn the deaths of 2,606 people in the September 11, 2001 attacks on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Gathered there were the families of the victims, with police, firefighters, celebrities, politicians, and musicians in abundance. The event, introduced by James Earl Jones and emceed by Oprah Winfrey, ran for well over 2 hours. It featured rabbis of every branch of Judaism, Catholic priests and bishops, archbishops, Catholic, Greek, and Armenian Orthodox, Sikh and Hindu leaders, Muslim leaders, male and female, Protestant leaders from the Black Church, mainline and evangelical wings. Police officers and firefighters read scriptures. The shofar was blown. Children sang, and tears were shed. American religious history had come a long way in 5 centuries. People were able to openly offer their religious prayers of lament and for healing across faith lines. New York's religious leaders were also on their best behavior that autumn day, aware that the attacks on the World Trade Center, on the Pentagon, and an aborted one that ended in a plane crash in a Pennsylvania field, presumed to be targeting the White House, were themselves motivated by a violent brand of religious interpretation of Wahhabism Islam emanating from Saudi Arabia. Those gathered at Yankee Stadium to sing, chant, recite scripture, and pray all sought to fight violent religion with their own brands of peaceful wisdom of the ages. If one were to analyze what the individual faith representatives said that day, one would notice that they were leaning hard in the direction of inclusion, offering the most open-minded things that their traditions had to say to neighbors and strangers, versus the "our way to ultimate reality is the right way" kind of messages that account for there being so many different religious groups in the first place. One clear exception was one Protestant representative of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Reverend David Benke, president of its Atlantic Division, who used pointedly Christian language throughout his prayer. The first of his 3 petitions went like this: "O Lord our God, we're leaning on you today. You are our tower of strength, and we're leaning on you. You are our mighty fortress, our God who is a rock. In you do we stand. Those of us who bear the name of Christ know that you stood so tall when you stooped down to send a Son through death and life to bring us back together. And we lean on you today, O tower of strength. Be with those who mourn the loss of loved ones. Bring them closer to them, to us day by day." Benke's prayer included allusions to Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress," and was as evangelical as anything said that day. He even ended his prayer "in Jesus' name," thus making the rest of the audience Christian, at least by implication. It was surprising to some, therefore, that of all the people who participated in the interfaith service televised nationally from Yankee Stadium, it was Pastor Benke who was sanctioned by his church for participating. For this participation, he was accused by other pastors in his denomination with 6 sets of ecclesiastical violations, including syncretism, mixing religions, unionism, worshiping with non-LCMS Christian clergy, and violating the Bible's commandment against worship of other gods. Hence, David Benke was suspended from that denomination's roll of pastors. He never apologized for his action and was restored to the ministry on appeal the next year. During the interim, he was asked about his decision to step forward as a spiritual leader, and he told reporters, "The religious impulse is extremely strong and vital in the human heart, and will lead people to places they would not go on their own. It is not only a high and altruistic thing, it is a dangerous thing." This history of religion in America from pre-Columbian times to the present century is a history of contraries, of inclusion and exclusion, of abiding piety that leads to wisdom and reform, and passionate righteousness that leads to schism, dissent, and even more. A word for students. If you have taken an American history course, especially in high school, you might reflect on when religion came up in the course of a typical 500-year-long story. Certain episodes are deemed religious: Pilgrims, Puritans, Prohibition, the election of Jimmy Carter, the faith of George W. Bush. Others have religious dimensions: immigration and nativism, abolitionism, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and protests against abortion. Yet most of the great events of American history are taught with as little reference to religion as possible, for perhaps no other reason so strongly held as the separation of church and state in its customary interpretation in U.S. public schools and consequently the textbooks they buy. To be on the safe side, the less said about religion, the better. Religion-free American history turns out to be incomplete history, a bit like learning chemistry without attention to oxygen and carbon. Just as these elements are constituent of so much of physical life, so also religious ideas, organizations, motivations, and conflicts turn out to be central to a large amount of the story of America and its people. So consider this an invitation to learn American history with a new set of lenses, the ones your teachers, school boards, and politicians have conspired to keep from you. Let us suppose you are one of the growing numbers of the so-called nones, people who, when asked for their religious preference, reply, none. What is the payoff in a religious history of America for you? Or let us suppose you are very religiously committed to your own group and have little initial interest in learning about someone else's religion. What do you have to gain by learning about American religion, what Henry May called the mode, even the language in which most Americans, during most of American history, did their thinking about human nature and destiny? What everyone gains through this kind of study is insight into the ways Americans, Native American, Black, White, Asian, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Baha'i, and so many others, thought about the meaning and conduct of their lives. All of us live in an American culture shaped by those who went before us. Many of our fellow citizens, though also living in a world of vaccines, the Internet, television, and 24/7 cable news, also think in ways that are highly inflected religiously. So whether you are not very religious, or very committed to a particular faith, or are somewhere in between, the history you encounter in this book is one to which you are a recipient. These people, ideas, and groups shaped American culture for better and worse. So this is a good place to warn you that you will meet religious heroes and heroines and villains, good and bad ideas, and inconsistent people in this book. Learning about them will help us avoid being too solemn about religion, which, after all, is a human phenomenon. It is about human beings seeking and worshiping divine things more than it is about what or whom they seek and worship. Moreover, one cannot be perfectly objective, since that makes one boring and bloodless when it comes to people and groups who use their religions to impress and oppress, though we shall endeavor to be fair. There are no both sides to religiously inspired enslavement of human beings, or to forced suicides in Jim Jones's Jonestown, for instance, though we shall try to be fair in conveying the evidence about the bleaker sides of history. Difficult definitions: America, religion, and history. It hardly makes sense to begin studying the history of religion in America without defining the key terms. Thus, here we provide a brief discussion and delimitation of how this text understands and will use these three important terms, each of which are the subjects of countless books on their own. America. America was not so much discovered as invented. That is, there was a great contiguous land mass running from the Arctic Circle in the north to the Southern Ocean circling Antarctica, with a great many people living on both of its major continents and many islands. But the land mass had no name until a rich financier and adventurer named Amerigo Vespucci visited parts of present-day Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina in 1499 through 1504. He made and signed a map of the continent, showing that what Europeans were sailing to was not Asia. Early in the 16th century, two subsequent cartographers, Martin Waldseemüller in 1507 and Mercator in 1538, would feminize his name into America and put it on their maps, first for South America, and then used it for all of the Western Hemisphere. America, therefore, is a story of invention and application to unknowing peoples who had been on both continents for perhaps 30,000 years. As a concept, it also began to fire the imagination of colonizing Europeans who decided that they needed to be there, in America. In this book, we will begin with the religious aspects of this invasion of America by the Spanish and Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and finally the English. Then, as America itself begins to be more and more associated with the people and the nation that became the United States, we will follow that thread of the American story most closely. One, however, should be alert to the places and times after 1776 where the story of American religion is characterized by geographic expanse and ethnic enrichment. In a religious history of America, sometimes America goes from being the place where the history takes place to being the religious object of devotion itself, as in the memorial service at Yankee Stadium we referenced earlier, where the gathered sang hymns to America the Beautiful, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the Star-Spangled Banner, and above all, the brassy request, demand of the deity, God Bless America, that became a second national anthem of reassurance at sporting events nationwide for most of the next decade. At moments like these, scholars like to talk about a civil religion existing in America, a set of fundamental values, rituals, and beliefs that bind Americans to their nation and to one another, independent of their other particular religious commitments. Both America's many religions and America as religion figure into our story. Religion. In a study of American religious history, it is useful to have a definition of religion that can guide us. Throughout this book, we will take religion to mean belief in and resort to superhuman powers, sometimes beings. One will note that this definition, borrowed from our fellow historian John Butler, is capacious enough to include religious people and practices that do not presuppose a personal deity, as in the case of many Buddhists and practitioners of nature religion, along with the Muslims, Jews, and Christians who are theistic, focused on a divine or supreme being. Our definition also avoids those religion is good faith, everything else is bad kind of definitions that plagued religious historians and even anthropologists of the past, who like to set up distinctions between religion on the one hand and magic or superstition on the other. In our view, religion is not on one side of the spectrum, with magic and superstition on the other side. Since it is critical for the sake of learning, we ask one to stay open to the possibility that if people believed or practiced something seriously, it stands as religion. Indeed, adopting this perspective may open us up to the possibility that Americans before us, and among us still, may have occupied several serious religious stances at once. Great-grandpa may have been a Freemason and a Methodist with equal seriousness. Great-grandma might have been a faithful Catholic and a practitioner of Santeria. Part of the religious diversity story of America takes place in individual lives. Mother may pray to St. Jude for healing and wear a New Age copper amulet on the same aching wrist she prays about. Religion in America? It's complicated and fascinating. Americans customarily express a belief in God, or a supreme, transcendent being in the upper 90% range in public opinion polls, even into the early 21st century. If this is so, others ask, why are religious congregations not packed each weekend? Are Americans religious hypocrites? Or does their belief in transcendence operate both within and beyond ecclesiastical forms? We think a broader definition of religion allows us to explain something about religion in America and to remain alert to subtle signs of religion in America throughout its long history. History. Even though the events of the past are forever fixed, their meaning and significance shifts by virtue of later interpretations, assessments, and questions put to this historical record. In this sense, it is not unfair to say that questions create history, in the sense of the history one learns about later. One way most contemporary courses in the history of religion in America differ from those of the middle and past century is that attention has shifted from traditional religious groups, such as mainline Protestant denominations and Catholicism, to examining the religious dimensions of racism, gender, and social reform in America that are more clearly seen now than in the past. Was religion for or against the forces of justice in America? Did religion defend or decry slavery, for example? Did religious leaders promote women's rights or seek to limit them? As we shall see, often the answer is both. But what religious ideas and practices won and lost the day, and which stayed on the sidelines? These happenings often turn out to have explanatory force for things we care about in our time. Since all of history can be defined as change over time, our study of American religious history will look closely for those things that have changed in the historical record. Yet the narratives that are composed about those changes, including this one and the ones audiences will form for themselves, are the products of the questions brought to the historical record about what changed and about who mattered, when. Thus, history, what happened, has a dynamic relationship with historiography, the written accounts given of what happened. The questions we ask can sometimes bring to light new, previously unexplored dimensions of the past. For example, students in the past learned much about the 2-hour-long sermons preached by early American male ministers. These students' questions, where are the women in this story, and what did people listening to these sermons think, led to exciting discoveries about female piety, church membership, and lay disobedience even in the most pious towns. These learnings figure into the way this book relates to the story of early American piety. Likewise, questions about enslaved persons constantly subjected to the biblical text, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters," Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, New International Version, led to historians' discovery of neglected primary sources about the invisible institution of so-called slave religion, and revised the historiography reflected in this textbook. Where to begin? A new world for everyone. Much of the popular and scholarly debate in American history in recent decades surrounds the question of where to begin. Does one begin American history with Jamestown? With Plymouth? With the Spanish and French, or with the indigenous peoples who were already living in the Americas? Or does one try to avoid the vexatious question of beginnings by pursuing a thematic approach instead? American religious history is not exempt from this debate, but we have chosen to tell the story with a chronological frame, since it is the one most familiar to students already schooled in American history. Consequently, we begin with large-scale contact in the Americas between Europeans, native peoples called Indians, first by mistake. In this book we prefer tribal group names when known, but use Native American Indian, and indigenous, as appropriate to the context, because these are widely used by the descendants of indigenous people to positively refer to themselves. Next, we move very quickly to regard Africans from more than 36 different linguistic and ethnic groups brought here in slavery. For all of these people, this became a new and transformed world, however much they sought to hold on to or transplant the ways of their homelands. This had profound consequences for the religious and cultural history of the Americas, and particularly the nation that would emerge as the United States. America is a land of many beginnings when it comes to religion. What we call Alaska, Florida, Arizona, Virginia, Massachusetts, and what was once called Huronia are all good places to begin the tale. Yet every religious group and religious person thought, in some measure, that their beliefs and practices were coming with them as religion with a capital R, the only and right religion. Thus, they approached the New World as a place where their religion would be continued, a fresh beginning of their own, if you will. As it turned out, the religious story of America became how much the new context transformed the old faith, because in the end, process was as important as place. Some of the great successes and failures, even for the dominant Europeans, as we shall see, came by virtue of being remade in the process of indigenization or creolization, mixing. They were not just Europeans abroad, since they tried to recreate London in Boston, Charleston, and other cities over time. For Africans, the adaptations were complex. The Middle Passage, the division of families, and even separation from people of one's native tongue on the auction block meant that North America was, for some, an utter disconnect from previous life. Others found places and people with whom to continue to practice Muslim prayers, plant food familiar from West Africa, and even continue with familiar religious practices as conjure under conditions of plantation slavery. After 1492, Native Americans also dealt with a new world. They were confronted by disease and Europeans who wanted to trade, take their land, or save their souls. The one path unavailable was remaining unchanged. The religious consequences of peopling North America from so many stocks did not end in the 16th and 17th centuries, however. An extraordinary dimension of the religious story of America is that people kept coming, bringing their religions with them, and changing American culture in the process. That is as true for the early Quakers coming to New England and Pennsylvania as it is for recent Yazidi refugees coming to America in the wake of the Islamic State's attack on their homeland in Iraq, beginning in 2014. People and their faiths drive our story. So American religious history is not just about the pilgrims, who yet are interesting. And we will tell their story early on and add more and more fascinating people to the history along the way. Amid the astonishing diversity one will encounter, the authors warn you, are mostly different kinds of Christians who did not recognize one another as being as similar to each other as we would today. It would be unfaithful to the people who populated America in earlier times to paint a more interfaith picture than existed. But we shall be certain to notice religious diversity as it arrives in our story, thus drawing your attention to how much the diversity story begins as an intra-Christian set of struggles and competitions. We will focus on Christian parts of the story more, because there were more Christians. But we will also attend to other parts of the story of religion in America as they arise, especially since the numbers of other religions' adherents mean that they achieve a greater historical impact. The action: exclusion and conflict, inclusion and consensus. Listeners hearing that a mostly Christian cast of characters will appear in this book need not fear that the plot will lack for action. It does not take many people, religious or otherwise, to stir up the question of whether civil society should be influenced by more faith, or whether government should be free.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?